A pale winter mist drifts across the English countryside, softening the outlines of a barbed wire fence that stretches endlessly into the fog. Inside, rows of wooden huts sit silent beneath the watch of a single guard tower. German prisoners, their uniforms worn, faces hollow from years of war, gather at the perimeter. Breath clouds the cold morning air as a low rumble echoes from beyond the trees. Out of the haze emerges a convoy, not of tanks, not of trucks, but of British drovers. Civilian farmers on horseback, their coats thick with mud and wool, guide herds of cattle and horses down the narrow road skirting the camp. The rhythmic clatter of hooves and the calls of herdsmen fill the still air. A sound of life, of work, of peace. The prisoners stand transfixed. They had been taught that Britain was collapsing under starvation and chaos. Yet here they saw order, compassion, normalcy. No hatred in the eyes of the drovers, no vengeance, only quiet purpose. For many, it was the first moment the war began to lose its meaning. To understand why these German prisoners were so shocked, we must step back to see the world they came from, and the Britain they now lived in. By late 1944, the British countryside was dotted with hundreds of small, fenced compounds, the quiet result of a war that had spanned continents. Since 1940, when the first German airmen were captured after the Battle of Britain, Britain had become an island filled not only with soldiers and civilians, but also with the enemy, prisoners of war transported across oceans to be held securely on its soil. As the Allied campaigns expanded, from the deserts of North Africa to the hills of Italy, and finally the beaches of Normandy, tens of thousands of captured Axis troops were shipped to Britain. They arrived by the shipload, guarded but exhausted, their uniforms sun-bleached and torn, their pride surrendered long before their weapons. By 1944, more than 150,000 German POWs were held in the United Kingdom, scattered across more than 1,000 camps. Britain now faced an unusual dilemma. The country was fighting for survival, yet it carried a moral burden to uphold the laws of humanity even toward its enemies. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention, prisoners of war were entitled to food, shelter, and fair treatment equivalent to that of the captor's own troops. For a nation bombed nightly and rationed to the bone, this was no small commitment. Yet, Britain chose to honor it. The War Office and Red Cross inspectors ensured that camps maintained minimal living standards. Wooden barracks with stoves, communal kitchens, medical huts, and access to correspondence. Unlike the brutality seen in the East, these camps were organized with military precision and quiet restraint. From Scotland's cold moors to the soft hills of Devon, POW compounds took many forms. Some were converted schools or derelict estates. Others were hastily built Nissen huts surrounded by wire and watchtowers. Guards were often older soldiers or men unfit for frontline duty, more caretakers than captors. As the war dragged on, Britain discovered another use for its prisoners. With millions of British men serving overseas, the island faced a desperate shortage of labor, particularly in the countryside. Farms lay idle, fields went untilled, and herds lacked hands to tend them. The solution came quietly but decisively. Rural work camps, where German POWs would contribute to the land they once sought to conquer. Under supervision, they plowed, harvested, and repaired fences, earning small credits for their labor. For many, it was their first encounter with the rhythms of ordinary British life. In these remote corners of England, surrounded by fields rather than battlefields, the war took on a different tone. It was no longer about conquest or ideology, but survival, coexistence, and the endurance of decency amid destruction. And as Britain's food crisis deepened, this relationship between prisoners and land would grow even more essential. By the middle of the war, Britain was fighting not only on the front lines, but also in the fields. The nation's survival depended on its ability to feed itself, a task that became almost impossible after millions of men were drafted into the armed forces. Tractors sat idle, livestock numbers fell, and once productive farmlands began to wither under the strain of neglect. The country faced what the Ministry of Agriculture called a quiet front, a war against hunger. To counter this, the government mobilized every available hand. Women stepped into roles once held by fathers, brothers, and husbands. The Women's Land Army, established in 1939, became a lifeline for British agriculture. Young women traded city shoes for muddy boots, learning to plow, drive tractors, milk cows, and mend fences. Alongside them worked elderly farmers, schoolboys, and civilian drovers, skilled handlers who moved herds of cattle and horses across counties to sustain Britain's meat supply. Yet even this vast civilian effort was not enough. The countryside needed muscle, and it came unexpectedly from the enemy. Beginning in 1943, as Allied victories in North Africa filled prison ships, the government authorized German POWs to work under supervision on British farms. At first, there was public hesitation. Many farmers, their sons fighting abroad, bristled at the idea of the Hun walking their fields. But necessity outweighed sentiment. Soon, guarded work details became a common sight. Groups of German prisoners repairing fences, gathering hay, or walking alongside drovers moving livestock to markets and railheads. For the prisoners, it was a world they had never imagined. Nazi propaganda had painted Britain as a land of ruin, a starving, desperate island. But here, even under rationing, they saw abundance and order. They watched drovers pass with sturdy horses, well-fed cattle, and civilians moving freely without fear or oppression. Women gave them tea through the wire. Children waved without hatred. The contrast to the image they had carried of their enemies was profound, even disorienting. Some began to write home in disbelief, describing British discipline and fairness. Others felt shame, realizing that their captors treated them with more humanity than they had shown to others. In these moments, between barbed wire and open field, between guard and prisoner, small bridges of understanding began to form. The work became more than necessity. It became quiet diplomacy, unspoken but powerful. And so, through the rhythm of rural life, German prisoners and British civilians began to see each other not as enemies, but as men simply trying to endure the same war. 1. The human angle. For the captured Germans, surrender felt like erasure. The soldiers who once marched under banners of triumph now stood behind wire, stripped of identity and purpose. In the early days, silence ruled the camps. Men too proud to speak, too lost to hope. Yet the monotony of days slowly reshaped them. The discipline drilled into them as soldiers became routine as prisoners. Roll call, meals, work, rest. Small gestures from British guards, a nod, a cigarette, a shared word, began to pierce their isolation. Within months, the bitterness dulled. They built makeshift gardens, played football, carved wooden toys. Adaptation came not from surrender, but from survival. In quiet corners of rural England, men who had followed orders all their lives began, perhaps for the first time, to think freely. The agricultural angle, the British countryside was starving for hands. Every available man had gone to war, and yet the fields still demanded labor. German prisoners filled that gap, under strict supervision, but growing trust. They tilled soil, harvested grain, and tended livestock. Their skill surprised many. Many POWs had been farmers before soldiers. They worked efficiently, respecting the land as if it were their own. In return, they received food, fair wages in camp credits, and something rarer, dignity. For Britain, it was necessity. For the prisoners, redemption through purpose. The land became a bridge, an unspoken understanding between conqueror and captive. By war's end, POWs had helped produce millions of tons of food, feeding both civilian and military Britain. Their work, unseen yet vital, turned fields of conflict into quiet symbols of coexistence. The social angle at first, fear ruled the villages. Mothers pulled children indoors as columns of German POWs marched past. But distance could not survive the closeness of rural life. Farmers soon found themselves working side by side with former enemies, separated only by a guard and a few words of broken English. Curiosity replaced suspicion. Kindness replaced silence. A dropped tool would be handed back. A loaf of bread quietly shared. Local drovers passing camps exchanged nods, small acts of mutual recognition. Slowly, the wire fences lost their meaning. By 1945, POWs were attending local church services, helping with harvest festivals, even joining cricket games. The war's front lines felt far away. Here, the struggle was human, not political. In the rhythm of daily labor, two worlds began to merge. Proof that dignity can survive even in captivity. The psychological angle, the greatest battle many POWs faced, was not against their guards, but within themselves. Years of Nazi indoctrination had taught them they were superior, destined to rule over weaker nations. Yet in captivity, that illusion unraveled. The British guards were firm but fair, the civilians orderly and calm, their society functioning even under the strain of war. Each day outside the wire challenged everything the prisoners had believed. Watching British drovers command herds with quiet confidence, seeing women operate machinery and men labor without fear, these images shook their internal hierarchy. Gradually, resentment gave way to reflection. The idea of enemy and master dissolved into something simpler: human parity. For many, this psychological unlearning would define their post-war lives far more than defeat ever could. The moral angle: Britain's treatment of prisoners became a moral statement as powerful as any weapon. Where Germany had built a system of fear, Britain enforced restraint and legality. Every loaf of bread, every medical check, every allowance of letters home was deliberate, a demonstration that even in war, decency could prevail. The Geneva Convention was not merely obeyed but embraced. The Red Cross inspected camps freely. POWs were allowed religious services, education, even theater performances. Such gestures carried quiet weight. They told the prisoners that Britain's strength lay not in cruelty, but in conscience. For German soldiers raised to equate mercy with weakness, this was deeply unsettling. It forced them to see their captors not as enemies, but as proof that democracy could survive barbarism. Not by matching it, but by refusing to become it. The military angle managing tens of thousands of enemy soldiers across a small island was no small feat. Yet Britain turned this logistical burden into a moral victory. Every camp was run with military precision. Daily counts, strict discipline, clear routines. Escapes were rare, not through fear, but through order and fairness. The War Office coordinated with local councils, ensuring POW labor supported farms, forestry, and rebuilding efforts without compromising security. Each camp became a miniature model of controlled coexistence. Soldiers respecting soldiers, even across the divide of war. For the Allies, it was more than containment. It was a quiet assertion of values. In contrast to the chaos of occupied Europe, Britain's system of humane captivity became evidence of its stability and moral authority. Behind barbed wire, the war's moral balance was being measured, and Britain was winning it quietly. By 1945, the fences that had once defined captivity in Britain began to lose their meaning. The war in Europe was nearing its end, and with Germany's collapse came a new challenge: what to do with the thousands of prisoners still housed across the British countryside. The answer arrived quietly: a single policy change that would transform both sides of the wire. In early 1945, German POWs were officially permitted to work outside their camps without constant armed escort. It was a gesture of trust and a test of character. Across rural England, from Suffolk's gentle farmlands to the moors of Derbyshire, groups of prisoners began to walk freely through villages, their uniforms now marked only by small PW patches. The local population watched warily at first, unsure whether these men could be trusted. But what followed would become one of the quietest yet most remarkable transformations of the war. At Camp 50 in Derbyshire, local farmers recalled the first mornings when German work parties arrived without guards. They came carrying spades and tools, greeting villagers with hesitant English. Expecting hostility, they found politeness instead. One drover remembered offering a cigarette to a young prisoner while herding cattle past a work site. And the man's expression, a mixture of shock and gratitude, said more than words could. In Suffolk, near Hoxton, prisoners helped with harvests alongside civilian drovers and members of the Women's Land Army. They mended fences, repaired barns, and drove wagons through villages that had once feared them. The British supervisors noticed that productivity rose, discipline improved, and escape attempts ceased altogether. Freedom under watch had turned into trust without need for weapons. For the prisoners, the experience was disorienting. They had marched across Europe believing themselves masters of a broken continent. Now they were laborers among the very people they had been told were inferior, and yet treated them with dignity. Some confessed in letters home that they were ashamed to be enemies of such people. The moment marked an unseen turning point in the moral fabric of the war. In the open fields of England, German soldiers began to live not as captives, but as men rebuilding what their own nation had destroyed. They were still prisoners, yet they were also participants in something far greater: reconciliation through labor. And in this fragile coexistence, small acts of kindness, a shared lunch, a gesture of help, a smile from a drover passing by, became quiet victories of humanity over hatred. Soon, that humanity would deepen even further, as peace returned and former enemies began to rebuild the same land, side by side. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the war was over. But for thousands of German prisoners scattered across Britain, captivity continued. Repatriation would take years. In the meantime, the same hands that had once built fortifications for the Reich were now rebuilding the very nation they had tried to destroy. The countryside became their workshop of redemption. With Britain short of labor and resources, POWs were assigned to projects far beyond farming, clearing bomb debris from cities, repairing bridges, rebuilding barns, digging irrigation ditches, even helping restore roads and railway lines. No longer under the shadow of barbed wire, they moved among civilians daily, watched but rarely feared. Villagers greeted them with nods, offered cups of tea, sometimes even small gifts at Christmas. It was during this period that true friendships began to form. In rural Derbyshire, a drover named Thomas Harper recalled working alongside a German named Ernst, a former cavalryman. Together they drove cattle between villages, talking through broken English and hand gestures. When Ernst's group was reassigned months later, Harper later wrote, "I shook his hand, not as a prisoner, but as a man." Such encounters multiplied across Britain. At harvest festivals, prisoners played violins in local halls. Some painted murals in churches. Children who once hid behind their mothers now ran alongside them as they worked. These were small moments, invisible to generals and politicians, but they marked the emotional climax of Britain's moral stand in the war. For the German soldiers, it was a revelation. The propaganda that had fed their pride, the image of the decadent, broken British, crumbled completely. They saw a nation that had suffered but refused to hate. Many later said it was in those months, not in the trenches, that they truly lost the war, not to British guns, but to British decency. In journals and letters smuggled home, POWs described how they had come to see their captors as proof of another kind of strength: discipline without cruelty, patriotism without blind faith, victory without vengeance. The phrase, "Der Feind war nicht, was wir dachten," "the enemy was not what we thought," appeared again and again in those writings. And as the seasons turned and the land healed, so too did the men who worked upon it. But even peace carried consequences for both nations, and for the men who now faced an uncertain future beyond the fences they had come to accept as home. The war had ended, but the presence of more than 400,000 German prisoners of war across Britain created a complex new reality. Repatriation was neither simple nor immediate. Europe lay in ruins, transportation networks were shattered, and the British economy itself teetered on the edge of exhaustion. For the authorities, the question was both moral and logistical: how to send home an army of captives when home itself, for many of them, barely existed anymore. Between 1945 and 1948, the process unfolded in careful stages. The earliest releases went to the sick and wounded, followed by non-combatants. But the majority stayed, not behind barbed wire, but integrated into daily life. Camps gradually transformed into communities of labor, helping to rebuild the country they had once fought against. Britain, short of manpower and money, relied heavily on their hands. On the farms, their contribution was immeasurable. Wartime food production, once on the verge of collapse, began to rise again. By 1946, German POWs made up nearly a third of the agricultural workforce. They plowed fields, harvested grain, and maintained livestock long after the fighting had ceased. In the Midlands, records show that in some villages, half the able-bodied workers were former enemy soldiers. As months turned into years, a surprising phenomenon emerged. Many prisoners did not want to leave. Life in Britain had offered them a stability and fairness they had not known under Nazism or the devastation of post-war Germany. Some had fallen in love with British women, others had found purpose in their work, or simply peace in the quiet rhythm of the countryside. By the time repatriation finally accelerated in 1947–48, thousands of POWs applied to remain permanently. The British government, recognizing both their value and good conduct, granted residency to many. It was one of the most unexpected outcomes of the war: the transformation of captives into citizens. In the words of one report by the Ministry of Agriculture, their labor rebuilt not only our fields, but our faith in human decency. The British landscape, green, scarred, yet enduring, stood as living proof that even in the aftermath of the world's darkest conflict, reconciliation could grow from the soil itself. But beyond the policies and numbers, it was the personal stories, the shared humanity discovered in captivity, that defined the true legacy of this chapter. When the guns finally fell silent, the stories that endured were not of battles, but of people. Farmers, drovers, and former soldiers who had once faced each other across enemy lines now shared tables, tools, and trust across rural Britain. Letters and interviews preserved these quiet transformations. A Suffolk farmer recalled, "At first, we were told not to talk to them. But you can't work side by side for months without words. One day you share tea, the next you share stories." For many Britons, the German prisoners became less a symbol of war and more a reflection of themselves. Young men who had simply obeyed orders, endured hunger, and longed for home. From the POW's side, testimonies often carried disbelief and gratitude. One former Luftwaffe mechanic who had worked on a Devon dairy farm later wrote, "They treated us as men, not monsters." I began to wonder who the real enemy had been, them, or what I'd believed in. Such reflections reveal the quiet revolution that occurred in the countryside, hatred giving way to understanding. Drovers, who once guarded livestock beside the wire, began to teach the prisoners how to handle horses, mend harnesses, or tend sheep. British families sent food parcels to the camps. Prisoners carved toys or furniture in return. Even children in nearby villages remembered the Germans as polite, hard-working uncles who fixed fences and told stories in broken English. By 1947, many local councils publicly praised the conduct of German workers. Some communities petitioned the government to let them stay. Friendships endured through decades. Letters continued across the Channel long after the men returned home. A few returned to marry, to farm, or simply to live among those who had once been their captors. In post-war Europe, divided by new borders and old wounds, these small acts of mutual respect became powerful symbols of what peace could mean. Britain's treatment of its POWs had not just upheld international law, it had modeled the moral victory of restraint and humanity. The legacy of those years remains in oral histories, in the rebuilt barns and hedgerows, and in the memories of two peoples who, against all odds, found reconciliation in the most unlikely of places, a barbed wire camp surrounded by English fields. In the soft light of memory, the image remains, a line of weary German prisoners standing silent behind wire, watching British drovers pass with their cattle. What once felt like humiliation, the sight of freedom so near, yet so unreachable, became, in time, a lesson far deeper than defeat. It was the moment when many realized that humanity itself had survived the war. For all the violence and propaganda that had shaped their world, compassion proved the stronger force. The drovers, with their quiet civility and simple purpose, embodied a nation that chose discipline over vengeance and fairness over fury. Britain's adherence to decency, even in victory, disarmed not armies, but ideologies. Years later, when those former prisoners spoke of England, they did not remember barbed wire. They remembered kindness. They remembered the fields, the shared labor, the respect that needed no translation. The war had ended in ruins, but something unspoken had been rebuilt. The belief that dignity could exist even between enemies. That misty morning in 1944 stands now as a symbol, not of power, but of peace achieved through restraint. Where hatred might have lingered, understanding quietly took root. And as the camera of history fades to stillness, one truth remains clear. Sometimes the most enduring victory is not won on the battlefield, but in the gentle, unseen moments when one human being chooses compassion over contempt.